Thank you for joining iMeet.
Team ABIP webinar. Dr. Yarmus from the Johns
This
Hopkins
meeting is now being recorded.
Is going to be our guest speaker, and he's going to be discussing the often intimidating topic of how to build an interventional pulmonary clinical research program. Before I start, just a few quick housekeeping items. Actually, David, I just lost my connection. If you wouldn't mind taking over for a second.
Sure. So in terms of a few housekeeping items, we want to alert everyone that this webinar will be recorded and available for future listening and viewing by AABIP members on the AABIP website. We will also ask all participants to please mute your phone to minimize the background noise and optimize the listening experience for everyone involved and the recording. Also, during the session, you will notice that at the bottom left-hand corner of your window, you should see what looks like a bubble speaking icon. That is a chat box or chat icon, which you can use to type questions for the speaker. If the question is something that Dr. Yarmus wants to answer in the flow of his talk, he will opt to at that time, or we can also answer those questions at the tail end of the discussion. And then lastly, you will notice what looks like a projector icon on the bottom left-hand corner. That will allow you to toggle your screen between and pull up the slide sets that Dr. Yarmus will be using and speaking with. Lastly, we would like to make sure that everyone knows that the AABIP does not endorse any specific technologies or products, and that the contents and the views of the speaker are the opinions of the speaker, and not necessarily that of the organization as a whole. So at this point, what I'm going to do is pull up Dr. Yarmus's slides. And I would like to formally introduce Dr. Lonny Yarmus, who is the Associate Professor of Medicine and Clinical Chief of the Division of Pulmonary Critical Care at Johns Hopkins Hospital, where he is also the Director of Interventional Pulmonology Research. And he is going to be speaking, as we discussed, on the topic of developing a clinical research program. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Yarmus.
Sure. Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me. Thanks to the AABIP for arranging this, and thanks to everybody listening. I know it's evening for most of us, so I appreciate taking the time. So I'll get going. So I'm going to just kind of go through the sort of steps that we had utilized here in terms of developing a clinical research program, hopefully offer some pointers, some tips, and then obviously feel free to ask questions because a lot of this is really verbal communication back and forth and a lot of informal conversations on the side. So I'll get going here. So just funding disclosures, NIH funding with a few R's, and then a lot of, obviously, industry-supported clinical trial funding. So overview, some of the things that I think are pertinent to point out to start is really goals of for those interested in doing this, why you want to start a program in clinical or translational research, what's the mentorship, and how to merge those things, what's people's general background in research, and how that applies to building a program, understanding the local infrastructure of your hospital or university setting, and what's available. Spend some time on IRB, clinical trial agreements, and budgets when talking about any study, because I think that's a really important point that's rarely emphasized, and a lot of people don't have a firm understanding of what goes on in the background, and it's very helpful to know that so you can figure out how your funding lines work. Different types of studies that are available for funding, different types of funding resources, general publication strategies, and then ideally putting things all together after. So I'll get going. So first is, what's the goal? And in general, I think there's, a few examples that sort of build and bridge and define a lot of us. So, I want to get involved in industry trials like the ones going on for emphysema. Idea, want to study it, and now I need help figuring out how to get that project off the ground and how to do it, all the way up to, I want to be an academic physician scientist and have an academic career. Do you want to do all those things? Do you want to do none of those things? And I think this is probably one of the more important aspects of doing this, because for each of these examples, there's really a different path, and there's a lot of overlap, and we'll get into that as well. Sorry. So, first, mentorship, which I would argue, for someone like me who had very little formal research training in my medical training and fellowship training, finding a strong mentor is at least in my experience, has been one of the most potent or powerful ways of getting these programs off the ground. So this was actually a picture I took at chess last year. So the guy on the right is Gerard Silvestri, who many of you know is current president of the ACCP, and the guy sitting is my fellowship mentor, Stepi Mehta. And the two of them, I would argue, are 95% responsible for the bulk of my academic success. So, finding those people, reaching out to them, and I'll just give you a brief story because I think it's important. So after I'd finished training, so I did my interventional training at Hopkins, stayed on, and Dave Feller-Kopman, I was the first fellow under Dave, finished, started my clinical work on faculty, and over the first year just kind of got my feet wet, and then really understood that I was looking for more than just a clinical program and clinical activity, and I wanted to really try and build a research program. So I was at ATS and ran into Gerard Silvestri, who I had met one or two times, and said, hey, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I want to do. You've done it, you've been successful, what did you do? And I met the guy probably once or twice before that, and without any hesitation, he said, you know what, why don't you come down and come to MUSC, spend a couple of days, I'll show you my lab, I'll show you how I run things. So about a week later, I emailed him and said I was setting up a flight, went down there. He was surprised because he said he's been offering this to people for 10 years and nobody actually ever went. And it was the single most powerful experience of my research building career. So the stuff I learned by having that senior mentor about, what they're doing, how they do it, what's their research portfolio, what is their research infrastructure, it's not, these things are not in any books. And I think that's hopefully why you guys are here listening, to kind of learn from my experiences, and really, like I said, a lot of this goes to Gerard's credit. So understanding who's at your center. Do you have a local mentor for research? Is it somebody that trained you, or is it somebody else in your division or department? If not, reach out. There's plenty of people out there now. Thankfully, the field has really grown academically at a nice, steady pace over the past few years, and there's a lot of help out there. And people in general have been overwhelmingly willing to help and build people's careers. So, that's step one. And then think about, what's your background? So do you have a master's in public health? Do you have a master's in clinical research? Do you have an MHS? Do you have some background that's going to help you with some of the nuances of designing clinical trials, of statistics and power analysis and things of that nature? So using me as an example, I had none of those things. So I was at an annual review at Hopkins, and one of the faculty mentors said, hey, you should sign up for a Science of Clinical Investigation certificate program, which is essentially a mini master's. I did, and again, it's super helpful, gives a lot of basic background infrastructure about trial design, statistics. This is not something that's going to lead you to doing your own, in detailed statistical analysis, but it gives you the lingo and background enough to be able to go to a statistician and have a relatively knowledgeable conversation about what you're trying to get across and how to do it and allow that to progress. So I highly recommend at least some background there. So then moving on, really, what are the kinds of studies out there that we as interventional pulmonologists and advanced bronchoscopists can really target, and what's the niche and where do we fit in? And, there's a bunch of sort of overarching categories that I threw in here. So NIH, federal funding is kind of the gold standard for academic research, but it's A, not something that's traditionally been secured in the interventional pulmonary range, and B, in the current political atmosphere, funding lines are more challenging, and a lot of these things are more difficult than they historically were, but certainly something within reach. Society, foundation grants, CF Foundation, I just put some examples, the American Heart Association, ACCP, lung grants, ATS. All these things are readily available to all of us. We all get the emails. We all get the RFAs that these grants are out there, and then, just taking the step to take advantage of those. And I kind of listed these in a little bit of order in terms of most difficult to, a little bit more secured. Investigator-initiated studies, I think for the majority of us, myself included, this is a tremendous way to start. If you don't have infrastructure built, if you're looking to build your reputation and get a better understanding of the field, this is kind of the do-it-yourself grant. So this is the scenario where you come up with an idea, you write a summary protocol, you pitch it to industry, whether it's for bronchoscopy or pleural disease, whatever it is, come up with that concept, pitch the idea, gauge interest, and then you can get a relatively reasonably sized grant out of that, and make that into a single-centered project or a multi-centered project. Industry sponsored, these are the bronchoscopic lung volume trials that are ongoing, the pleural trials for different companies. These types of things where industry has come up with a protocol, they have a specific agenda, and you're invited to participate in those trials. These are also great, right? So these are preferential, usually centered around larger institutions and volume, but again, expressing interest and getting out there, understanding what is going on in the field, what trials are out there, and asking the question, hey, can I join, is something that I think not enough people do. And industry, it's almost afraid to ask in some circumstances, so the more that we're able to reach out as physician researchers, the more available these things will come. And then, at the local level, there's a lot of opportunities that I think need to be and should be taken advantage of. Career Advancement Awards being one, mini Ks or CSAs, things that will support your time institutionally. And again, these can be secured by a variety of mechanisms. They can be formal RFAs through the institution. They can be discussions with your division director, your department chair, things, non-traditional avenues of saying, hey, these are the ideas I have. This is what I'm going to try and get out of it. Are there any departmental or divisional funds for a pilot study, for example? So diving in a little bit more, one of the really important pieces about building any of these programs is you can't do it alone. So you have to start somewhere, and as soon as you get going, especially if you don't have a lot of experience or background, the sooner you learn that there's a lot more to this than just, hey, I want to enroll in a trial. So research coordinator support, I think, is a tremendous key to success, and early planning for how you're going to get that person, how you're going to fund that person, and what they're going to do is critical. So, the general research coordinator roles are running general research operations, IRB compliance, budgeting, invoices. So using our center, we have a dedicated interventional research manager who oversees all the IRBs. She actually handles most of the IRB submissions and revisions and updates. She will do all of the budgeting for us in conjunction with me, and we'll talk about that. So we'll actually review every budget, every payment, every balance, to get a really firm understanding of what financially is going on in your lab, and understanding what the available resources are. So starting out, most of us don't have just a pocket of money sitting there to pay somebody like this. So teaming up with other people in your division who have mutual interests and sharing research support is a really good way to do it. That's how we started. We actually bought 1 quarter time, my first year of starting the research core, of a research assistant who works on the ARDS network through Hopkins. And then over about 2 years, our portfolio built enough where we actually hired her outside the network, and she just took over for 100%. So as soon as you start building and successfully recruit, the sooner you're going to have that financial independence. There's a lot of ways to do this in your institution. So we have a lot to offer. It may not be specifically what your research interests are to start, but it can get you some financial support. So for example, oncologic tissue. So, we're biopsiers. So leveraging the power of that tissue with co-investigators from different departments can be very valuable, because using medical oncology as an example, there's a lot of clinical trials. We know that with immunotherapeutics, there's a lot more interest in rebiopsy and repeat tissue. These are very expensive drugs that have a long life to approval, and a little bit of salary support from these large companies are really very feasible. So definitely work towards that coordinator. And then you need other people, sort of not necessarily under, but working in conjunction with your research manager. And this is getting back to the Gerard Silvestri story. His infrastructural sort of pathway, or that we'll call the Silvestri rule, is exactly this. And we just mirrored this. And actually, this was the first research assistant that I hired. So a 22-year-old guy who came to Hopkins for the summer from UC Irvine as an undergrad, and was accepted into this pretty competitive summer research program where they fund somebody to come out for 2 months and then have a stipend and living and all that stuff. So he was assigned to our clinical lab for the summer, did a great job, worked hard. We had a lot of discussions, wants to go to med school, grades okay, hadn't taken his MCAT. So we sat down and I, mimicked the Silvestri rule and said, hey, look, what I can do for you is offer you a really crappy salary. You could work a lot, but, the flip of that is we'll produce a lot, we'll have a lot of publications, I'll guarantee you at least one first author project, and then if you work hard, we'll work harder to get you into great med school. So this kid did all that, right? By the end of it, he had 11 publications, one as a first author, and actually ended up getting a full ride to Harvard Medical School the following year. Now, he stayed for 2 years, but, the total, he made about $11 an hour, right? So the total cost of that and the return for a lot of that help and work output was well worth it on both sides. So this is a tremendous resource that more of us need to look at. There's tons of students out there who just either didn't have the greatest grades, want to get more experience, want to do something to have a better competitive footprint and landscape before making the leap to med school. And they're just hungry and looking for things like this. And it's really just a perfect mesh to bridge all these things and get these promising individuals further on in their career. And it's a great way to build yourself as a mentor, because these people really know very little about the medical landscape, and you're helping them all along their career. Every one of these people that I've hired over the past 6 or 7 years, I'm in constant contact with. Every one of them has also gone to medical school or graduate school. So it's a very successful model. So fellows, again, super tremendous resource. For those on the call that are at academic institutions or training programs, the field is growing, the presence of academics in interventional pulmonary is growing, and I think this is a good example. So a couple of things, depending on your institution, you need to ensure you have the expertise, capacity, funds, and you're ready to do this. So I don't think this is somebody that you take on in your first year. But it is something that you consider over years 2 to 5 once you've built up enough infrastructure. It's obviously an ideal opportunity to engage within the division and department and build, right? So for those looking for partners and interest, no better place than to have your own fellow trained by yourself in research or in the clinical arena, and then bring those people on and mentor them further as junior faculty. So at Hopkins, I used this example before, but I started year 1 on faculty, got my feet wet, went on and decided to build this research career, had my little visit with Gerard, and then went and said, all right, in year 2 at the end, next year, I went to Hank Fessler, who's our program director, and said, hey, do you think we're ready for a fellow? And he kind of chuckled, said no chance, said, interventional pulmonary, essentially said, it's really not an academic pathway, so this is not something divisionally that we're interested, which really completely pissed me off, but led to, kind of a fire and a stronger desire to kind of build that infrastructure and help change the landscape and perception of IP in the academic community. So we did that. We built a lot of research portfolio background, grant support. Jason Akulian, who's pictured in the upper right, was a pulmonary fellow at Hopkins and transitioned from the lung transplant lab over to us with all the good graces of the division, and everyone had a consensus that we were ready, and his career really took off. So he did finish his fellowship in pulmonary, did a formal IP training year, and then went off and now is the director at UNC and doing a great job with both clinical and research training. So just a couple of years later, as we cycled through, then we recently brought on 2 new fellows who are both early pulmonary critical care fellows. This is Jeff Tibidet and Chris Mallow, who are pictured there too. And these guys are superstars. So they're Hopkins pulmonary fellows. They're spending 3 years in our lab doing all this work. They both did their master's in clinical research as part of their fellowship. Jeff's applied for an NRSA with a goal for a K early on in his faculty. Chris has applied for multiple NIH grants as well as societal grants. And it doesn't just help them as a mentee, but as the mentor, it really helps build our own careers too. So all of this assistance led to multiple R grants within our own lab, and then lo and behold, 7 years later, after being laughed at, we're now the second highest funded section within the Division of Pulmonary Critical Care at Hopkins, which is 80 faculty, with the COPD lab being the largest. But it's a very rapid transition to go from nothing to a lot, which has been exciting. So how do you pay for it all, right? And this, I think, is a critical piece that very few people spend the time to understand. And I can't underestimate the value of understanding where the money flow is, what you have in the bank, and what you do with it, and how it's controlled. So I can tell you right now, to the dollar, how much money we have in our research accounts. I can tell you where those things are allocated, what support, and it's really valuable on multiple levels. It's understanding who you're supporting. So, for example, all of the research support that we have, research manager, research administrator, and 5 different research assistants, all those people are funded by these grants. So if our lab goes broke, those people have a 4 to 6 week termination period, and they no longer have a job. So you think, the mentorship is beyond just academics. It's helping the mentees and your employees have secure work. But it also allows us, importantly on the academic realm, to do a lot of other things. So if one of the fellows I talked about or our interventional research fellow says, hey, and for example, our current interventional research fellow in the second year of training, Diana Yu, is doing basic science bench work on airway stenosis after lung transplant. So the lab needed reagents, the lab needed multiple pieces of equipment, and that was just funded by the profitability of our lab from some of these other trials. So, what you can do with that money and understanding that is variable based on the type of grant support that's given. So NIH federal funding budgets the budget. You put in 10% or 15% for your R, and that money is going directly towards your percent effort as an investigator in the institution. Investigator-initiated studies, again, these are the ones where you say, hey, company X, this is my idea, these are the outcomes, these are my aims, here's what I think is going to happen, this is how much I think it's going to cost. Are you interested in funding it? There, the potential is, we think, really tremendous. So when you're allocating your research percent effort support, 10% of my salary is a lot more than 10% of my research coordinator's salary. Because of the clinical activity that we all do as proceduralists, most of us actually self-sustain our own profile just by clinical output. So you may not need that 10% support to support your salary, but you can still allocate that support. And then because you have freedom to utilize the funds for industry investigated studies, you have the capacity to then use that and allocate that internally how you want. So if I make $100,000 a year at the powerhouse salary of Hopkins, then I can take $10,000 of that money, put it aside, and use it for lab support. Industry-sponsored studies, again, these are the big ones, right? So, for example, we just participated in a study that was actually run by MUSC that some of you may have also helped with, which is PION was the name of the study. It was a new moderate sedative drug that's going through FDA approval now. That was an extremely well recruitable study and one that was very lucrative in terms of the per patient costs. So we understood that, did a very detailed review of what the capacity of our center would be to enroll and recruit those patients, and went to town. Ended up being, I think, either the highest or second highest recruiting center, and ended up making a lot of money to support additional research. But on that same note, you need to know what your limitations are. So what you don't want to do is say yes to industry for bronchoscopic lung volume reduction studies and not have any COPD emphysema patients, right? Because then you're wasting a lot of time and money on both resources. So understanding not only what your capabilities are, but what your patient flow is. And lastly, trust no one, right? Understand where that money is, what happens to it, where it's kept, and what you're able to allocate and for what. IRBs can be really difficult at institutions. So Hopkins is really a classic sort of, very stringent IRB program. It is center dependent. So knowing, do you use a local IRB, or are you using Western IRB, or are you using central IRBs? But really, whatever it is, spend the time, figure out what your local IRB level is, understand how it works, understand who is on your panel. So using our institution as an example, there's, I think, 5 or 6 different IRB panels. They meet weekly. There's an additional high-risk IRB. There's an oncology IRB. And over time, you get a sense of where your studies are going, who your IRB leaders are. And in general, these are people who are us, right? They're physician colleagues. They're paid for their time and effort. And I think of them as a study section leader for federal funding, where somebody you can reach out and say, hey, here's what I'm thinking. What are your thoughts on the IRB for something like this? And it can save you a lot of time and effort to revise things before formal submission, which is very helpful, especially in some of those investigator-initiated and industry trials, which tend to be a little bit more involved, a little bit higher risk, and a little bit more time-intensive. And the faster you get through, the faster you recruit, and the faster you can get done with the study, which is great on the financial side institutionally, but it's even better, obviously, on the industry side because that's the goal, for them to get through these studies and complete them safely and productively. And that leads to more, right? So you take an example and run with it and recruit highly and do a good job and have the support, then you're at the the list the next time that company or somebody that dealt with you in those studies comes along. You're the top of that list to be tagged to go forward. Clinical trial agreements, another super important thing. This is mostly for industry, between industry and the university settings. It's filled with a lot of legal jargon that goes between both sides. And does a really good job allowing both sides to protect themselves from intellectual property, patient risk, all those factors. That being said, there's a lot of lawyers, they have a lot of work, and you need to be the champion to get this through. So we constantly communicate with these people and try and optimize things. And a very helpful thing on our end has been when we're working with industry, we will send each of your institutions has a clinical trial agreement template that is preferred by the institution. I will send that, and you're completely 100% allowed to do this, to industry and say, hey, can you guys work off this? It's going to decrease that timeline significantly. So that's a very important piece that will save you a lot of time. Also, as important, these things need to be done before, even if you have IRB approval, if you don't have your clinical trial agreement and budgeting, you really shouldn't be enrolling. So these things all need to happen in conjunction with one another so that you can get, check all the boxes and move forward well. So when you do what, and this goes to my point earlier, I basically, for the most part, we'll do it all at the same time. However, we have weekly lab meetings, and we will do a very detailed analysis of some of these trials to figure out, should we be doing it? So I'll give an example of, not specifics, but there's a company looking at trying to treat bronchoscopically early-stage lung cancer. And seemed like a reasonable trial design. And recruitment was a little tough because there was some specific inclusion and exclusion criteria that were going to make this difficult, especially treating patients pre-resection. So patients have to go through additive risk. So we looked at the budget, looked at the analysis, looked at what our patient flow was, and recruitment wasn't an issue, but the time and budget needed to recruit a really small number of patients, because if it's a pilot study, just didn't hold up. And it wasn't going to be financially worth our lab investing that time to do that. So it's okay to do that. And actually in this example, I had very open and transparent discussions with industry and said, look, this is what we're thinking. This is the bottom line. This is what we could do it for. And if that's outside your budgetary limits, then so be it. Let's shake hands and work together another time. And that's exactly what happened. And everybody was happy because we didn't waste time, they didn't waste time and money, and we moved on. So talked a little bit about this, but research opportunities, there's a lot of opportunities. And here I kind of have a relative impact factor of what these things mean on a local and academic level, right? So your pilot study grants are the things we talked about. Go into your institution, go to your division, go into your department, see what kind of funds there are. You'd be surprised. There's a lot more than you think, and they're readily available. I'll talk a little bit later. One of our research fellows, Chris Mallow, right now is looking at a trial, looking at video games and their impact on simulation training for bronchoscopy. So there's an internal grant that he had a presentation today. He did an amazing job, and it's highly likely to get funded. So these things don't need to be Nobel Prize winning projects. They just need to have infrastructure, interest, and reasonable outcomes. investigator-initiated study grants, again, I talked about that earlier. This is really the ideal pipeline, I think, for a lot of us. Industry-sponsored grants, career advancement grants, all the way up to NIH federal funding, and collaborating with people that have funding on the federal level. So just a little deeper dive, great place to start with investigator-initiated studies. Do the literature search, talk to industry, get a sense of what's going on, and you can get a lot out of these things. They build great relationships, and they provide a really nice single center and multi-centered funding avenue. I think a really nice example is this is a picture of Chris Gilbert, who's a former fellow now out at Swedish Cancer Institute in Seattle. So when Chris was a fellow, we had a pulmonary critical care fellow, a guy named Biren Kamdar, who's out in California, actually does sleep and critical care rehab research, and came to one of our journal clubs and presented on ergonomics in GI procedures that one of his colleagues at UCSF was doing, which Chris found interesting, looked to the literature research, found that there was really nothing in the pulmonary literature. So as a result, we utilized the resources of the AABIP and designed a survey looking at, do interventional pulmonologists, advanced bronchoscopists, have ergonomic issues, muscle pain, back pain, wrist pain, and lo and behold, they do. So there's a pretty reasonable signal about back, shoulder, and some arm pain and wrist pain. So that was, a nice little study, published, had a good outcome. And about a year or so after the paper came out, Olympus introduced these rotating scopes that many of you are familiar with, right? So it's not an unreasonable connection to consider, maybe would a device like this help change the outcomes of some of these ergonomic signals? So we did just that and pitched an investigator-initiated study to Olympus, which was a prospective randomized controlled trial comparing rotational bronchoscopy to standard bronchoscopy on ergonomics and strain. And I think this is a great example of how to bring together multiple centers and institutional support. So one of the things we had early recognition of was we had no idea about ergonomics and the literature behind it. And I literally Googled ergonomics in Johns Hopkins, and lo and behold, there's a department who I then emailed the chair, who responded in 30 seconds and was super happy to help. Got together, had physiatrists, ergonometricians. Olympus got really involved. We did a multi-center trial with Hopkins, WashU, MUSC, Northwestern, Swedish. For those of you who don't know, there's a picture of Nick Pastis, who's at MUSC. And we actually had those black straps or avatars, so you come out with a video of somebody in a skeletal form looking at angles. Some of the other things that you see there are EMG data, right? So sort of out-of-the-box thinking that led from a simple survey to this great trial, which had a lot of collaborative effort on multiple different avenues, which the results are currently being analyzed. Industry-sponsored studies, we talked about this. These are the medical devices, screening, usually very well-funded, still have freedom to control those internal payments, and a great way to build a war chest that we talked about in terms of being able to support your lab in dry times, being able to do extra projects. Again, they're time-consuming. Make sure you can enroll. Make sure you have the support to do them and do them well. Federal funding, this is, for the slide reference, is the Holy Grail, right? So this is what, as a field, I think we all need to strive to obtain, because this is the gold standard for academics. So NIH funding, NCI funding, PCORI funding, understand the positioning and probability. Doesn't need to be you alone. You need to have mentorship, find that mentorship. There's great grant writing courses out there for the NIH that translate well over to everything else that we're doing, and obviously the academic value is really high. This is just a nice summary of how these things fit in, and I think if there's any junior people on the call, understanding where those pathways lie. If you're still in fellowship, NRSAs or F32s are a great avenue to build. There's a lot of interest in lung cancer, obviously, but it doesn't have to stop in training, right? So K pathways now traditionally used to be a fellow pathway, and they're much, much more likely now as junior faculty, junior investigators to be funded. So these things are all out there. Understanding the platform and understanding how they work is important, and it works. So back to my Gerard example. So this is me. So I got out of fellowship in 2010, did my research, really just spent a lot of time clinically in the beginning, and started as an instructor, started thinking about research, went to see Gerard, applied for my first investigator-initiated protocol, published a bunch, got promoted, kept going, right, and just kept building a higher research portfolio, got a bunch of additional mentorship, got a large NIH-funded R41, got early promotion, right? And these bars are just our lab's publication portfolio. So the point here is just, all of these grant efforts are going to circle back and give you a lot of manuscript output, a lot of academic credibility, and a lot more opportunities to succeed academically. Same with training. So this is a paper published by Hans Lee a couple of years ago looking at academic productivity. So here's H-index, which is citations plus publication numbers of IP training from a one-year fellowship versus a two-year fellowship, so obviously having a bit more clinical research time. But this goes, and all these things fit nicely along a normal pipeline of academics. The more senior you are, the more publications you have, the more promotion, the faster you'll be to promotion. Same with additional training, advanced degrees for your masters and things of that nature. So why should we care as a field? So, from a university practice standpoint, research leads to promotion. From a community practice, there's a ton of potential, right? So the field right now is wide open for research. And the concept of the ivory tower, sort of lack of generalizability, is a real deal. So getting engaged on the community level with additional sites or even locally is incredibly valuable to us academically and the field in general to understand what's going on and what the associated outcomes are. And we really need this for this field to be taken further as a credible field on the academic landscape. So briefly, the other reason for this, again along the same lines of credibility, is in terms of specialization. The first field formally was created in 1917, 1933, a bunch of ABMS fields, and you can just kind of see in this timeline that there have been gaps and ebbs and flow in terms of creation of fellowships. And this is all pretty well data-driven, but if you look at the ACGME, what is a standard and important metric for creation of an independent field to have ACGME gold standard accreditation is the field has to show independent clinical and research needs and productivity. And that's something that we're doing a lot better at than we had historically, but it's something that I think we can all work harder at. So, how do we get there? Right, and we talked a little bit about this, but historically, IP has been a procedure-driven field. How much clinical output, how many RVUs, and publications were, how do I do it? This is a case report, small single-centered studies, limited funding, no NIH track record. So pushing that to the next level is really how we get to those accreditation standards, academic standards, whatever your goal portfolio is, this is a great way to do it. So we need research, we need collaboration, and the AABIP, the AIPPD, these organizations have done, I think, a really nice job at trying to build that infrastructure on the academic educational platform and informational platform, but we still need more for research. If you go out, you can talk to industry and see what people think. And one of the common perceptions are there's no go-to place, there's not a lot of collaboration, and there's not a lot of infrastructure. So using that, we've modeled a system with a bunch of other institutions that I'll discuss in terms of trying to do that. And that background was just modeling on the Radiation Therapy Oncology Group, or TOG, which you might be familiar with, is a very well-known, very well-established research infrastructure network for radiation oncology. And historically, how did it start? Well, it started with one guy in 1968. Dr. Simon Kramer at Jefferson said the same thing. We need to do this. This is what the field needs. He did his first RCT in 1968, got his first funding 3 years later, and then since then there's been over 90,000 patients recruited in, I think it's now over 500 trials, published in over 800 papers, right? So it doesn't take long. Industry got involved. There's billions of dollars now in support for some of these trials. And they've led to things like, all of a sudden, radiation therapy is now being considered in some circumstances equivalent to surgery, right? So if we're going to do this on the bronchoscopic platform and we're going to look at treatment of lung cancer, we have a long, long road before we can catch up to the literature base of surgery and SBRT. And we're going to need each other's help to do that internally. So we're actually, the other thing is I don't feel like, as interventional pulmonologists, we've done a great job of naming trials well, like the cardiologists. So we're trying to peg names to everything. So this is now the Interventional Pulmonary Outcome Group, or IPOG. Again, really, to our knowledge, the first collaborative effort. It's a completely open effort designed to work as a group, and really over a short period of time has become kind of the go-to resource for multi-center trials and industry to participate and work together. And here's just a couple of examples of what's going on right now with these. There's an Olympus radial EBUS trial that's completed. There's a cryobiopsy trial. There's tracheal stenosis trials, lung cancer trials, right? And these are just a few examples of what's going on. But the theme here is multiple sites, right? So we have between 3 and 10 sites participating in these trials, either actively enrolling or close to enrolling. And it all pays off. So this was really the first IP NIH-funded trial in the field, $1 million budget, multi-center trial, Hopkins, Duke, UNC, looking at airway injection of chemotherapeutics for lung cancer. So very specific to what we do, relatable, and really a great platform to kind of push these multi-center trials on a federal level. So just to finish up, I think this concept is really where we all need to go to build. And yes, it's a great platform for collaboration within clinical trials, but it's also a great network for anyone to reach out and have these conversations and figure out, what resources are available and who can help with what. And really a great opportunity for junior faculty to engage and get involved. So I always get this question, how do I get involved, right? And this is a great way to do it. Come up with an idea, ask to be involved in current trials, and just move forward and push. There's a lot of people out there willing to help. So finishing up, the IP-related research opportunities are just endless. To think about what institutionally we've done and what the field has done in the last 5 years, and link that to what a COPD researcher or asthma researcher is able to accomplish, it's night and day. There's so many more opportunities and unanswered questions in our field that allow us to do this that it's silly not to take advantage of this. But you have to start somewhere. Hopefully this will kind of give a little bit of a base to do it, and ask for help, right? I was helped, and now I'm more than willing to help other people as a result of that. So collaborate and send me ideas, and let's start working. There's just a bunch of people from our lab because, you can't do this alone. So the more support and help you have, the more successful you're going to be. I will stop there and see if anybody has questions, and thanks for listening and hanging in.
Dr. Yarmus, that was excellent. We have a question from Dr. Kalandri. It's a relatively long question. Would you like me to read it, or would you just want to read it yourself on the bottom left?
Let me see here if I can do this. Yep. All right, yeah, I'll read it out. So it's how do you propose we balance clinical commitments, building an IP program and ICU with building researchers infrastructure, especially when there are not many IP faculty in the group? So I think that's a great question, and one that we are very sensitive to in regards to our fellows going out. And I'll use Dr. Koulian as an example. So he's been out for 4 years, finished here, went to UNC, built up a large clinical program, and we've been mentoring, talking all along to say, look, we need to figure out a cut date where you build up enough and you say, all right, I need to go to my division and say, I've done what you asked me to do, I need help. And that's exactly what happens. So you have to leverage your clinical productivity to be able to get the resources that you need. And that may be a sacrifice of salary, right? So a lot of what's held back IP academically is the concept that we do a lot of procedures, so we bill a lot, so we can make a lot of money. And that may or may not be true, but it may not be the best avenue, because if you're getting paid more to do more, then you're expected to do more, and no one's going to have a sob story for you if you ask for less time. So I think making that commitment and expressing that, if that's really what you want to do, is a great way to do that. Also, reaching out to your colleagues, right? You don't have to start all this on your own, but you have to start somewhere. So getting involved with ongoing trials, smaller trials, local trials, and lastly, just collaborating with other people in your division or department that may be established already, helping with BAL studies for asthma or, lung cancer tissue. Things of that nature may not get you a lot of academic credibility to start, but they can get you funding, and then you can use that to offset your time. Hopefully that answers some of your questions. Any other questions?
So while we're waiting, Lonny, this is David. I'm going to first put in a plug that you had mentioned societal funding or grant funding. Just for the audience to remember that the AABIP does have a research grant that is awarded on a yearly basis, and along with other large organizations like the ACCP or the ATS. But if you are interested in that funding source, please take a look at the AABIP website. And as I mentioned, we have a research committee that awards that on a yearly basis. I'll throw out a question there for you, Lonny. I think one of the hard parts is getting over that initial amount of inertia to get the ball rolling. You had mentioned buying a little bit of time from a coordinator as an example. But I think one of the things is that we don't really learn the skill sets to actually do this. Who do you go to? Where do you learn about the budgetary aspects and the money side of running industry-sponsored trials, or any other sort of the monetary side of all of this?
Yeah, great question. So it's generally there's a budget office or a budget center, and for Hopkins as an example, you can and the majority of people on faculty in our division do this. They will have a trial and they'll submit the protocol to the budget and say, just tell me what it is. And in my experience, that number is actually far less than other sites, for example, might get. There's not a great answer to a how-to other than you have to dive in and try and figure it out. And this is not something that happened overnight. This took a couple of years to really get down and fine-tune. But working with budget administrators, your divisional administrator is a great resource, right? So these are people who oversee divisional finance, and as part of that, they have a deep understanding of federal and non-federal funding lines and what is allowable for those things. So that's another tremendous resource. And same with the clinical trial agreement. And IRB, just really it's a reach out and discuss. Some institutions have actual overviews. So Hopkins actually has a clinical trial portfolio book that kind of reviews a lot of this. So things like that I think are out there. You just have to look and find them.
guess if there's no other questions while we're waiting, I just want to say that that was a fantastic talk. It really delves into something that is important, but people often are in the dark about and don't really know where to begin. Spend a lot of time and effort going down a track without really a clear goal. So we really appreciate that talk, Dr. Yarmus.
Sure, and on the note you guys mentioned before, which I totally forgot and shouldn't have, is one of my second grant was the AABIP grant. So we applied for a grant for lung transplant airway stenosis, pathophysiology and outcomes, and we're actually still building on that research, years later. So any of these resources are great, and I think it's great from a societal level that we're able to help support junior people do this.
Wonderful. Dr. Shaw, unless you have any other comments, maybe we will be having our next webinar announcement come out shortly. Dr. Shaw, do you have the details on that?
We don't have a date yet, but the next planned talk will be by Dr. Arthur Sung from Stanford. It'll be in the month of, we're aiming for the month of October, on the topic of management of massive hemoptysis from the interventional pulmonology perspective. But we will be announcing a date once we lock that in.
And then just finally, just to plug everyone, please remember, if you're going to go to CHEST, the AABIP meeting PD course is wonderful, and if everyone can sign up, I think it'll be a great experience.
And we also have the AABIP Research Symposium held twice a year, which is, again, a great format for some of the discussion that Lonny was talking about today in terms of bouncing off ideas of research ideas for projects and having a great chance to network with other individuals at that time. So at this point, I would like to thank Lonny for joining us and, again, giving us a wonderful insight into his experiences and his knowledge into creating a clinical research program within the field of IP. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight, and have a great evening.
Sure, thanks.